The dust in San Rojo did not just sit on the skin, it bit into it, finding purchase in the creases of elbows and the corners of eyes, grinding down hope until it was as fine and dry as the powder blowing off the mesas. Clara Rios wiped the counter of the Golden Spur Saloon for the 100th time that night, her rag gray and damp with spilled whiskey and tobacco juice. She kept her eyes down. That was the first rule of survival she had learned when she took this job 3 years ago. If you do not look at them, they might forget you are there. If you are silent, you become furniture, and men do not assault furniture. They might break it in a fit of rage, but they do not hunt it. She was 22 years old, though the sun and the wind had etched fine lines at the corners of her eyes that made her look older. Her hair was thick and dark, pulled back severely and hidden beneath a rough cotton scarf. She wore a dress of faded brown wool that offered no hint of the shape beneath it. It was armor, of a sort. In a town like San Rojo, located precariously on the edge of the New Mexico territory where the law was often just a suggestion written in pencil, a woman alone was prey. The saloon was roaring, a cacophony of piano notes missing their mark, the clatter of poker chips, and the roar of laughter that usually preceded violence. Clara moved through the maze of tables like a ghost, collecting empty glasses and dodging grasping hands with a practiced, fluid motion. She felt the weight of gazes on her back, heavy and hot, but she did not flinch. She simply vanished into the shadows near the kitchen door. It was past 2 in the morning when the crowd began to thin. The air in the saloon was thick with smoke and the sour smell of unwashed bodies. The barkeep, a man named Silas who possessed a heart as shriveled as a dried apple, jerked his chin toward the back door. He wanted the slop buckets emptied. Clara nodded, not speaking, and hefted the heavy wooden pail filled with dishwater and refused. She stepped out into the alleyway. The night air was shockingly cold compared to the stifling heat of the saloon, and the sky was a vast, indifferent canvas of stars. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. Clara moved toward the cesspit at the far end of the alley, her boots making no sound in the dust. Voices drifted from around the corner of the building, low and urgent. Clara paused. She knew those voices. One was deep and gravelly, carrying the weight of authority that had gone rancid. Sheriff Tanner. She should have turned back. She should have dropped the bucket and run inside. But a name caught her ear, a name associated with the payroll shipment due from Santa Fe. Curiosity, a dangerous flaw she thought she had stamped out years ago, held her feet to the ground. She crept closer to the edge of the wood-slatted wall, peering through a gap where the timber had warped. 3 men stood in the gloom. Sheriff Tanner was recognizable by the glint of the tin star on his chest and the bulk of his frame. Beside him stood a man Clara had seen only on wanted posters, Jack Kincaid, an outlaw with a reputation for leaving no witnesses. Between them knelt a third man, his hands bound behind his back. He was weeping, his sounds muffled by a gag. Tanner took a step forward, his boot crunching on the gravel. He spoke clearly, his voice devoid of pity. He said that the man knew too much about the route. He said that loose ends were a luxury they could not afford. Clara stopped breathing. She watched as Tanner drew his revolver. It was a slow, deliberate motion. The kneeling man squeezed his eyes shut. Tanner did not hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The sound was not a bang, but a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very wooden slats Clara pressed against. The kneeling man slumped forward, his life ending in the dirt of a back alley. Tanner holstered his weapon and looked at Kincaid. He told the outlaw to dump the body in the arroyo before sunrise. He said the payroll wagon would be at the pass by noon on Friday, and that the soldiers guarding it were on his payroll too. Clara stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned to flee, but her foot caught the edge of the heavy slop bucket. It tipped over with a wet, splashing crash that sounded like a landslide in the silence following the gunshot. She froze. Around the corner, the voices stopped. Heavy footsteps pounded toward her. Clara did not wait to see them. She dropped the handle and ran. She bolted toward the rear of the boarding house where she rented a room. her skirts gathered in her hands. "Behind her!" A voice roared. It was Tanner. He shouted that someone was there. He shouted for Kincaid to stop them. Clara burst into her small room, her hands shaking so violently she could barely light the kerosene lamp. She did not light it. Darkness was her friend now. She was moved by feeling, frantic and terrified. She knew what she had seen. She had seen the law shaking hands with the devil. If Tanner knew she was the one in the alley, she would be dead before the sun cleared the horizon. She dragged her carpet bag from under the bed. Into it went a change of clothes, a box of cartridges, a loaf of stale bread, and a canteen. From the bottom of her wardrobe, she pulled out a heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. It was an old Colt Navy revolver, a relic her father had left her. She had practiced with it in the canyons when no one was watching, but she had never fired it in anger. She strapped the holster around her waist, the leather cold and stiff. She could hear shouting in the street now. They were searching. Clara slipped out the window. She knew the livery stable boy. A young mute named Thomas often left the rear door unlatched. She ran through the shadows, sticking to the alleyways, avoiding the pools of lantern light that spilled from the houses. The stable smelled of hay and horse sweat. Clara moved to the stall of a roan gelding she knew had stamina. It belonged to the doctor, but the doctor would not be needing it to run for his life tonight. She saddled the horse with trembling hands, tightening the cinch with a strength born of pure adrenaline. She led the horse out the back, walking him until they hit the soft sand of the riverbed so his hooves would not clack on the hard-packed earth of the street. Only when the town was a cluster of dark shapes behind her did she mount up. She kicked the horse into a gallop, heading north toward the jagged silhouette of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. She did not look back. The sun rose like a judgment, harsh and unforgiving. The desert was a furnace. The heat shimmered off the ground in waves, distorting the horizon until the scrub brush looked like dancing demons. Clara had been riding for hours, pushing the roan hard. Her throat was parched, the water in her canteen warm and tasting of tin. She kept to the washes and the low ground, trying to stay off the skyline, but the desert offered little cover. She knew Tanner would not come alone. He would send men who knew how to track. It was mid-morning when she saw the dust cloud behind her. It was small, miles back, but it was moving with purpose. She urged the gelding faster. The horse was lathered, its breathing labored. She whispered apologies to the animal, promising rest that she knew she might not be able to give. The terrain began to change, rising into rocky foothills. This was dangerous ground. The path narrowed, winding through clusters of boulders and steep inclines. A crack masked the sound of the wind. Stone exploded 3 feet to her left, spraying her with sharp fragments. Clara screamed, ducking low over the horse's neck. They were closer than she thought. She risked a glance backward. 3 riders were closing the distance, their horses powerful and fresh. She saw the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels. Another shot rang out. This one buzzed past her ear like an angry hornet. Clara drew the Colt Navy, though she knew the range was too great. She fired blindly over her shoulder, more to scare them than to hit anything. The recoil jarred her arm. She kicked the roan, forcing it up a steep shale slide. The horse scrambled, hooves striking sparks against the flint. The third shot found its mark. It did not hit her square, or she would have been dead. The bullet grazed the outside of her upper left arm, tearing through the fabric of her dress and carving a furrow through the flesh. The pain was immediate and blinding. A white-hot brand seared into her skin. Clara gasped, nearly losing her grip on the reins. Blood, hot and sticky, began to soak her sleeve. She did not stop. She could not stop. She guided the horse into a narrow fissure between 2 towering rock faces, a path too thin for them to ride 2 abreast. It was a desperate move. The trail led up, sharply up, toward the high country where the air grew thin and the pines began to choke out the sagebrush. The outlaws slowed at the base of the climb. She heard them shouting, arguing about whether to follow her up the treacherous path or flank her. That hesitation bought her time. Clara rode until the world began to tilt. The pain in her arm throbbed in time with the horse's hoofbeats. She was lightheaded, black spots dancing in her vision. The heat of the lower desert had given way to a biting chill as she climbed thousands of feet in elevation. But she was shivering from shock, not cold. The horse stumbled. Clara pitched forward, her grip failing. She slid from the saddle, hitting the ground with a bone-jarring thud. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She tried to rise, but her limbs felt like lead. She dragged herself toward the base of a pine tree, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She checked the cylinder of her revolver. 3 shots left. She listened. The wind whistled through the needles of the ponderosa pines. A hawk screeched somewhere high above, but she did not hear the pursuers. Not yet. She closed her eyes. Just for a moment. The darkness was inviting. It promised an end to the pain in her arm and the terror in her heart. She knew she should stay awake, keep moving. But the exhaustion was a heavy blanket she could not throw off. Her head lolled back against the rough bark. Eli Morgan had not spoken to another human being in 6 months, and he preferred it that way. He was a man carved from the landscape itself, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and sorrow. His beard was thick, threaded with premature gray that matched the steel of his eyes. He wore a long duster coat that had seen better decades, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He was returning from the mining camps to the west, where he had sold 20 head of cattle for enough gold to buy supplies for the winter. He rode a massive bay stallion that was as temperamental as its owner. Eli saw the horse first. It was a roan gelding, saddled but riderless, grazing on a patch of mountain grass near the trail. The reins were trailing on the ground. Eli pulled his stallion to a halt. His hand dropped instinctively to the Winchester rifle in the scabbard by his knee. A riderless horse in this country usually meant trouble. Snakebite, mountain lion, or a fall, or worse. He dismounted, his boots crunching softly on the pine needles. He approached the roan slowly, speaking in a low, calming rumble. He caught the reins and checked the saddle. There was blood on the leather. Fresh blood. Eli scanned the area. He was a man who noticed things. A broken twig, a disturbed patch of moss. He followed the drag marks in the dirt. They led to the base of a large ponderosa pine. At first, he thought it was a boy. The figure was small, huddled in a coat that looked too big. But when he moved closer, moving the branches aside, he saw the braid of dark hair and the curve of a cheekbone. A woman. Eli stopped. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The old ghost of a memory he tried to drown in whiskey and solitude. He did not want this. He did not want complications. He lived up here, near the timberline, to escape the world and its endless capacity for cruelty. He knelt beside her. She was unconscious, her skin pale beneath the dust. He saw the dark stain on her left arm. He touched her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, rapid and fluttery like a trapped bird. She groaned low in her throat as he touched her, her right hand twitching toward the holster at her hip. Even in sleep, she was fighting. Eli sat back on his heels, looking at her. She was running from something. The dust on her clothes was from the lowlands, the red clay of the valley floor. She had ridden hard and climbed fast. He could leave her. He could ride down to the nearest settlement, a day away, and tell them where she was. But looking at the sky, he saw the heavy, gray underbelly of clouds rolling in over the peaks. A storm was coming, a bad one. By the time he got back with help, she would be frozen or eaten. He cursed softly, a word that was lost in the rising wind. He holstered his rifle and slid his arms under her. She was lighter than he expected, fragile in a way that made him uneasy. He lifted her, her head lolling against his shoulder. She smelled of sage and sweat and iron. He carried her to his stallion, lifting her into the saddle and mounting behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to hold her upright. He grabbed the reins of the roan gelding and tied them to his saddle horn. "Hold on," he muttered to the unconscious woman. They began the climb toward his cabin. It was another hour up the mountain, hidden in a box canyon where the wind could not reach. As they rode, the temperature plummeted. The first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting down in lazy spirals. The cabin was built of heavy logs, chinked with mud and moss. It was low and sturdy, with a stone chimney that promised warmth. Eli dismounted and carried the woman inside. The interior was sparse but clean. A single room served as kitchen, living space, and bedroom. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center. In the corner was a bed covered in buffalo robes and wool blankets. He laid her down on the bed. The cabin was cold, the fire having died down to embers while he was gone. He moved quickly, stoking the coals and adding kindling until flames licked up the chimney. He lit a lantern and hung it on a hook near the bed. The light threw long, dancing shadows against the logs. Eli approached the bed. He needed to see the wound. He pulled a knife from his belt, a tool, not a weapon, and carefully cut away the sleeve of her dress. The fabric peeled away to reveal the angry furrow the bullet had plowed through her flesh. It was not deep enough to have shattered bone, but it had bled freely. It was caked with dirt and grit. He turned to the stove, pouring water from a bucket into a kettle. While it heated, he found a bottle of rye whiskey and a clean rag. A sound from the bed made him turn. The woman was awake. She was not moving, but her eyes were open. They were dark, almost black in the dim light, and they were wide with panic. She was staring at him, her chest heaving. Her hand scrambled at her hip, searching for the gun he had removed and placed on the table. "It is over there," Eli said, his voice rough from disuse. He nodded toward the table. She flinched at the sound of his voice. She pushed herself up, ignoring the pain that must have shot through her arm. She pressed her back against the log wall, pulling her knees up as a barrier. "Who are you?" she rasped. Her voice was dry, cracking. "Name is Eli Morgan," he said, keeping his hands where she could see them. He did not step closer. He knew the look of a cornered animal. "Found you down by the trail. You were half dead." She looked around the room, her eyes darting to the door, the window, the fire. "Where is this?" "High country, near the pass." "The men," she whispered. There were men. "Didn't see any men," Eli said. "Just you, and a horse that was about to drop." The water on the stove began to boil. Eli took a bowl and poured the hot water into it. He added a splash of the whiskey to the water and picked up the rag. "I need to clean that arm," he said. Clara watched him. He was big, filling the small room with his presence. His face was grim, unsmiling. But he had not hurt her. He had brought her in out of the cold. "I can do it," she said, though her voice trembled. "You can't reach it properly? And your hands are shaking." Eli stepped forward. Clara flinched again but did not retreat. There was nowhere to retreat to. She watched him come closer. He smelled of pine pitch, horses, and tobacco. It was a masculine smell, one that usually signaled danger to her, but there was no aggression in his posture. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning under his weight. "This is going to sting." He dipped the rag in the hot, whiskey-laced water. He took her wrist in his hand. His grip was firm but surprisingly gentle. His hands were callous, rough like sandpaper, but he moved with a precision that surprised her. As he touched the cloth to the wound, Clara sucked in a sharp breath through her teeth, her head falling back against the wall. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the urge to scream. Eli worked in silence. He scrubbed the dirt from the raw flesh, ignoring her whimpers. He poured straight whiskey over the wound to cauterize it. Clara cried out then, a short, sharp sound, and her hand gripped his forearm, her nails digging into his coat. He did not pull away. He let her hold on. "Almost done," he murmured. He bandaged the arm with strips of clean cotton. When he was finished, he sat back. "Bullet graze," he said, wiping his hands on a towel. It was a statement, not a question. Clara opened her eyes. The pain had settled into a dull, throbbing ache. She looked at him. She saw the intelligence in his eyes. He knew. "I fell," she lied. "On the rocks." Eli looked at her. He looked at the bandage. He looked at the Colt Navy on the table. "Rocks don't leave powder burns on your sleeve," he said quietly. Clara stiffened. I was hunting. There was an accident. Eli stood up. He walked to the window and looked out. The snow was falling harder now, a white curtain cutting them off from the world. You don't hold a gun like a hunter, he said, his back to her. And hunters don't ride a horse to death unless something is chasing them. He turned back to face her. The firelight caught the scars on his face, lines of history written in flesh. I don't care what you did, Eli said. And I don't care who's chasing you. But the snow is setting in. The pass will be closed by morning. You are stuck here. Clara pulled the buffalo robe tighter around her shoulders. She felt a strange mixture of relief and new fear. She was trapped, but the man standing before her, this stranger with the sad eyes, had not turned her out. Why did you help me? She asked. Eli looked at the fire. He seemed to be looking at something far away, something long gone. I don't know, he said honestly. He walked to the door and dropped a heavy wooden bar across it. The sound of the lock falling into place was loud in the small room. Get some sleep, he said. If anyone comes up that trail, the snow will hide their tracks, but it will hide ours too. Clara watched him as he moved to the corner of the room. Spreading a bedroll on the floor near the fire, he lay down with his back to her, his rifle within easy reach. She lay back on the pillow, the scent of him, wood smoke and earth, filling her senses. She listened to the wind howling outside, a feral thing trying to get in. For the first time in 12 hours, her heart rate began to slow. She was safe. For now. But she knew Tanner would not stop, and she knew that by bringing her here. This man, this Eli Morgan, had just placed himself directly in the path of the storm that was coming for her. She watched the rise and fall of his breathing until exhaustion finally pulled her under. The snow continued to fall, burying the cabin, burying the trail, and burying the secrets that had brought them both to this high, lonely place. The silence of the high country was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin with the weight of the falling snow. For the first 3 days, Clara Rios existed in a haze of fever and pain, floating between the sharp bite of the whiskey Eli Morgan used to clean her wound and the dull throb of healing flesh. She watched him through half-closed eyes, her instincts honed by years of survival in San Rojo screaming at her to stay awake, to stay guarded. She expected him to demand something. Men always did, in the saloon. A kindness was a coin that purchased a liberty. A free drink meant a hand on her waist. A ride home meant an expectation of a kiss, or worse. But Eli Morgan was a cipher. He moved through the small cabin with the economy of a man who had lived alone for a long time. He cooked simple meals, venison stew, cornbread, bitter coffee, and placed them beside the bed on a wooden stool. He changed her bandages with hands that were calloused and scarred but surprisingly gentle. His eyes focused entirely on the wound, never wandering to the curve of her neck or the shape of her legs beneath the quilt. He spoke little. His words were functional. Drink this. Lift your arm. Sleep. Clara kept her hand near the hidden knife she had slipped from the table during her first meal. It was a dull paring knife, but it was steel, and steel was the only friend she trusted. By the 4th day, the fever broke. Clara sat up, the room spinning lazily before settling. The cabin was warm, the stone fireplace radiating heat that battled the creeping frost at the windows. Eli was sitting at the table, cleaning his Winchester. The smell of gun oil and solvent was sharp in the air. He looked up as she shifted. His eyes were the color of slate, unreadable. He asked if she was hungry. Clara nodded, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. She was wearing one of his flannel shirts, her own dress washed and hanging near the fire to dry. The shirt swallowed her, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She felt small, but the dizziness was gone. She ate at the table while he worked. The silence stretched between them, but it was less charged than before. It was the silence of two people waiting for a storm to break. Outside, the world had turned white. The snow had started in earnest the night she arrived and had not stopped since. It piled up against the door, drifting halfway up the window panes. They were entombed in winter. Clara finished the stew and pushed the bowl away. She watched his hands moving over the rifle mechanism. They were large hands, the knuckles swollen from work or fighting, the skin mapped with small white scars. She asked him why he lived up here alone. Eli did not look up. He slid the bolt back into place with a metallic click. He said that down there, people were too loud. He said peace was harder to find than gold. Clara touched the bandage on her arm. She said that peace was just a pause between fights. Eli stopped working. He looked at her then, really looked at her. And for a moment, the stoic mask slipped. She saw a flash of something profound and ancient in his gaze, a recognition of a fellow soldier in a war that had no name. He nodded once, acknowledging the truth of her words, and went back to his rifle. The days bled into one another, marked only by the changing light against the snow. As Clara's strength returned, the confinement began to chafe. She was used to moving, to working. Idleness gave her too much time to replay the image of Sheriff Tanner executing that man in the alley, the sound of the gunshot echoing in her memory. She began to help. At first, Eli tried to stop her, telling her to rest, but Clara was stubborn. She swept the floor. She kneaded the dough for the biscuits, working her frustration into the flour and water. She mended a tear in his coat, using a bone needle and thread from his supplies. They moved around each other like planets in a small orbit, careful not to collide. But the cabin was small, and the storm was relentless. It forced an intimacy that neither had asked for. One evening, the wind howled with a ferocity that shook the door in its frame. The temperature plummeted, and the drafts hissing through the chinking felt like ice knives. Eli built the fire high, piling on logs of seasoned oak until the flames roared. They sat in the two chairs before the hearth, the heat flushing their faces while their backs remained cold. Eli poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed one to her. Clara wrapped her hands around the hot metal. She looked at the flames. She asked him about the photograph she had seen on the mantel. It was a small daguerreotype in a silver frame, tarnished black at the edges. It showed a woman with a serious face and hair pulled back in a net, standing next to a younger, cleaner-shaven Eli. Eli took a long sip of his coffee. He stared into the fire as if reading a history written in the embers. He said her name was Sarah. The name hung in the air. Clara waited. She knew that tone. It was the tone men used when they spoke of things that had been torn away from them. Eli spoke slowly, his voice low and gravelly. He told her he had been a soldier. He rode with the cavalry in Virginia. He had 2 brothers, Thomas and James. They went in together in 1861, thinking it would be a grand adventure. By 63, Thomas was buried in a field in Pennsylvania, and James had died of gangrene in a hospital tent in Georgia. Clara watched his profile. The firelight cast deep shadows in the hollows of his cheeks. He said he came home to nothing. The farm was burned. The land was salted with blood. So he took Sarah and they came west. They thought the air would be cleaner. They thought they could outrun the ghosts. He paused, his hand tightening around the cup until his knuckles turned white. He said they found a spot in the valley. They built a cabin. Sarah was heavy with their first child. It was going to be a boy. He was sure of it. Then the fever came through the settlement. It moved faster than a prairie fire. He looked at Clara then, his eyes dry but burning with a cold intensity. He said he buried them both on a Tuesday. He said the ground was so hard he broke the shovel. After that, he could not stand the sound of other people's laughter. He could not stand the pity in their eyes. So he came up here, where the only things that died were the things he killed for food. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She had seen death. San Rojo was paved with it. But this was a different kind of hollow. This was a man who had been carved out from the inside until only the shell remained. She set her cup down on the floor. She told him she was sorry. Eli shrugged, a small, sharp movement. He said sorry for not changing the past. He looked at her. He asked about her family. Clara drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs. It was a protective pose. She was not used to sharing her story. In her world, Information was ammunition that could be used against you. But the storm and the fire and his confession had created a strange, sacred space. She told him she never knew her father. He was a miner who died in a collapse before she was born. Her mother was a washerwoman who scrubbed the clothes of the wealthy until her hands were raw and red. They lived in a shack on the edge of town where the wind blew the dust through the walls. She said her mother died when she was 15. That was when she went to work at the Golden Spur. Eli frowned. He said 15 was too young for a place like that. Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. She said age did not matter in San Rojo. Only hunger mattered. She told him she learned quickly. She learned that a smile could buy safety for an hour. She learned that if you poured the whiskey heavy, men became sleepy instead of mean. She looked at the fire, her expression hardening. She told him about a night 2 years ago. A drover who decided he had paid for more than just a drink. He had cornered her in the storeroom. He was big, and he smelled of cattle and sweat. Eli's body tensed. He did not speak, but the air around him seemed to vibrate with sudden violence. Clara said she had a bottle in her hand. She smashed it against the wall and held the jagged glass to his throat. She told him she would open him up like a sack of grain if he took one more step. She looked at Eli. She said he believed her. He backed away. But she learned something that night. She learned that nobody was going to save her. Not the sheriff, not the barkeep, not God. She had to save herself. She learned to watch men's hands. She learned to read the shift in their eyes when the liquor turned their thoughts dark. She touched the bandage on her arm again. She said that was why she ran. She saw Tanner kill that man, and she knew that her life was worth less than the lead in his gun. She was just a barmaid, a witness, a loose end. Eli leaned forward and placed another log on the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney in a swirling vortex. He said she was more than that. The words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of a judgment. Clara looked at him, surprised. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with respect. The night deepened. The wind outside screamed like a banshee. But inside, the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had shown each other their scars and found that they matched. Sleep came fitfully that night. The wind rattled the roof shakes, sounding like footsteps overhead. Clara dreamt she was back in the alley. The mud was sucking at her boots, holding her fast. She saw Tanner turning slowly, his face a skull, raising the gun. She tried to run, but her legs were paralyzed. The gun fired, the sound exploding in her ears. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark, save for the dying embers in the hearth. She was not alone. Eli was sitting by the window, a silhouette against the faint gray light of the snow-covered night. He was in a wooden chair, his rifle across his lap. He was not sleeping. He was watching the trail. Clara breathed out, a shaky exhale that misted in the cold air. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and padded across the floorboards. The wood was freezing beneath her bare feet. She stopped a few feet from him. She asked him if he ever slept. Eli did not turn. He kept his gaze fixed on the white void outside the glass. He said sleep was a habit he had lost a long time ago. Clara moved closer. She could see the tension in his shoulders. He was a coiled spring, waiting to snap. She asked him what he was afraid of. It was a bold question, a dangerous one, but the darkness gave her courage. Eli was silent for a long time. The wind whistled through a crack in the log wall. Finally, he spoke. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual stoicism. He said he was afraid of failing again. He turned to look at her then, in the gloom. His eyes were dark pools of torment. He said when he brought her up here, he told himself it was just for a night, just until the storm broke. But now he looked at her and he saw every person he had ever failed to save. He saw his brothers. He saw Sarah. He said he could not put another body in the ground. He did not have the strength for it. Clara felt a sudden, fierce ache in her chest. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it on his shoulder. The muscle beneath the flannel shirt was rock hard. She told him he had not failed her. She told him she was still here. Eli looked at her hand on his shoulder, then up at her face. For a second, she thought he might lean into her touch. He looked weary, so incredibly weary. But then the mask slid back into place. He shifted, and her hand fell away. He told her to go back to sleep. He said he would take the watch. Clara hesitated, then nodded. She went back to the bed, but she did not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the wind and watching the unmoving shadow of the man who was guarding her life as if it were his own penance. The storm broke 2 days later. The sun rose on a world that was blindingly white and agonizingly beautiful. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. The air so crisp it burned the lungs. The snow was 3 feet deep, burying the scrub brush and turning the pines into heavy white statues. Eli was outside early, shoveling a path to the woodpile. Clara was inside, boiling coffee, when the sound of a gunshot shattered the morning. She dropped the ladle, the metal clattering loudly against the stove. She grabbed the knife and ran to the window. Eli was standing near the corner of the cabin, his rifle shouldered. He was aiming down the trail. A wisp of smoke curled from the barrel. Clara looked where he was aiming. 200 yards down the slope, where the trail emerged from the tree line, a horse and rider were scrambling through the deep snow. The horse was panicking, rearing and turning. The rider, a man in a heavy sheepskin coat, was struggling to control the animal. He was not attacking. He was running. Eli did not fire again. He lowered the rifle slowly, watching as the rider spurred his horse back into the safety of the trees, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Clara threw open the door. The cold air hit her like a physical blow. She ran out into the snow, her boots sinking deep. She asked who it was. Eli watched the tree line for another long moment before turning to her. His face was grim. He said it was a scout, one of the men from the valley. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. They had found them. Eli walked past her, his stride long and purposeful. He went into the cabin and began pulling heavy wooden shutters from where they were stacked against the wall. He told her to get inside and stay away from the windows. Clara followed him in. Panic was fluttering in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by anger. She watched him barring the door, checking the sight lines. He was preparing for a siege. He was shutting her in a box. She told him she was not going to hide in the corner while he fought her battles. Eli did not look at her. He was checking his ammunition, counting cartridges into a leather pouch. He said she was wounded. He said she would only get in the way. The words stung worse than the bullet graze. Clara marched across the room and grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. She told him she had survived this long because she knew how to fight back. She said she was not Sarah. She was not a ghost for him to protect. She was flesh and blood, and she wanted a gun. Eli stared at her. The mention of his wife's name made his jaw tighten, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, she thought he might strike her, or yell. But he saw the fire in her eyes. He saw the trembling that was not fear, but rage. He looked at her hand gripping his arm. He looked at the revolver on the table, the Colt Navy she had brought with her. He pulled his arm free. He walked over to the table and picked up the heavy revolver. He checked the cylinder, spinning it with a practiced flick of his wrist. He said if she was going to shoot, she needed to hit what she aimed at. He said wasting lead was a good way to die. He motioned for her to follow him. They went out behind the cabin, where the wood pile offered a windbreak. Eli set up 3 empty tin cans on a fence post 20 yards away. The sun glared off the snow, making it hard to see. He handed her the revolver. It felt heavy in her hand, heavier than she remembered. Her arm was still stiff, the wound pulling tight as she raised the weapon. She aimed at the center can. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, the recoil sending a shockwave up her shoulder. The bullet kicked up a spray of snow 5 feet to the left of the target. Eli shook his head. He stepped closer. He told her she was jerking the trigger. He said she was anticipating the kick. He moved behind her. The heat of his body was a sudden, overwhelming presence against her back. He was so close she could feel the rough wool of his coat against her neck. He reached around her, his arms enclosing her. his hands covering hers on the grip of the gun. The world seemed to narrow down to that point of contact. His hands were large and warm, swallowing hers completely. His skin was rough, abrasive against her smoothness. But his touch was incredibly controlled. He told her to relax her shoulders. His voice was right at her ear, a low rumble that vibrated through her spine. He adjusted her grip, his fingers intertwining with hers. He lifted her arms slightly, correcting her aim. He told her to breathe. He said to squeeze, not pull, like a heartbeat. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could smell the soap he used, the scent of pine and clean sweat. She could feel the steady thrum of his heart against her back. The danger of the scout, the approaching gang, the cold, it all faded into the background. All that existed was the weight of the gun and the man standing behind her. A silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. It was not the comfortable silence of the firelight. This was a living thing, pulsing with a desire that had been smoldering under the surface since the moment he carried her into the cabin. She turned her head slightly. His face was inches from hers. She could see the gray flecks in his eyes, the fine lines of his weathered skin. He was looking at the target, but his focus was elsewhere. She could feel the tension in him, the restraint that held him back like a dam holding a flood. He did not move away. He held her there, encased in his strength. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. She wanted him to. The realization shocked her. She wanted this broken, dangerous man to close the distance. She wanted to feel something other than fear. But Eli Morgan was a man of iron will. He took a slow breath, the sound ragged in the quiet air. He squeezed her hands gently. One last correction. He whispered, "Now." Clara forced her eyes back to the tin can. Her heart was racing, but her hands were steady, anchored by his. She exhaled, letting the air empty from her lungs. She squeezed the trigger gently, just as he had shown her. The gun roared. The tin can flew off the post, spinning into the snow with a satisfying clatter. Eli did not let go immediately. He held the pose for a heartbeat longer than necessary, his chest pressed against her back, his chin brushing her hair. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped away. The cold air rushed into the space between them, chilling Clara where his heat had been. He cleared his throat. He said that was better. He said to keep practicing until she could hit it every time. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow. He did not look back. Clara stood alone by the woodpile, the smoking gun in her hand. Her skin was tingling where he had touched her. She looked at the fallen can, then at the retreating figure of the cowboy. She knew then that the danger outside was closing in. But the danger inside, the storm rising between her and Eli, was the one that terrified her the most, and the one she ran toward, despite herself. The snow did not stop. It fell with a relentlessness that felt personal, a white curtain drawn tight around the cabin to shut out the rest of the New Mexico territory. The drifts piled against the north wall were nearly as high as the roof, and the wind scoured the eaves with a sound like a woman keening. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine resin and the underlying, electric tension of two people trapped in a box. The threat of the scout had changed the geography of the room. There was no longer a separation of space. Eli Morgan had moved his bedroll from the corner to the foot of the bed, claiming it was to be closer to the door and the window in case the gang returned in the night. But Clara Rios knew it was more than tactics. Every time she turned in her sleep, every time the ropes of the bed frame creaked, she felt his presence. He was a sentinel, a dark shape in the gloom, his breathing steady and deep, anchoring her to the earth when her nightmares tried to drag her away. Clara healed. The furrow on her arm scabbed over, the angry red fading to a dull pink. Her strength returned, and with it came a restlessness that paced the small floorboards like a caged wolf. She helped Eli with the chores that could be done indoors. They cleaned guns. They repaired tack. They sat across from each other at the rough-hewn table, the silence stretching between them until it vibrated. It was not an empty silence. It was filled with the things they did not say. It was filled with the memory of his hands on hers when he taught her to shoot, the ghost of his heat against her back. Clara caught him looking at her when he thought she was not paying attention, his gaze dark and heavy, lingering on the line of her throat or the curve of her wrist. And she found herself watching him, studying the way the firelight played over the hard planes of his face, the way his muscles shifted beneath his shirt when he lifted a piece of firewood. On the 5th night of the storm, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The fire was roaring, battling the sub-zero chill that seeped through the logs. Eli had removed his heavy coat and was sitting by the hearth, mending a bridle. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the tanned skin of his throat and the top of his chest. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, watching him. She felt a strange, terrifying pull in the center of her chest. It was not just gratitude. It was not just the instinct to find a protector. It was a hunger she had thought burned out of her years ago in the back rooms of the Golden Spur. She stood up. The floorboards groaned. Eli stopped working but did not look up. Clara walked to the fire. She knelt on the rug beside him. The heat from the flames was intense, flushing her cheeks. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and touched the scar that ran from his collarbone down beneath his shirt. It was a jagged, ugly thing, a souvenir of a saber slash or a piece of shrapnel. Eli flinched. His hands shot out, catching her wrist. His grip was iron, reflexive violence. Clara did not pull away. She looked into his eyes. They were wide, startled, the pupils blown black in the dim light. "You are burning," she whispered. Eli looked at her hand, then at her face. He slowly loosened his grip, but he did not let go. He turned her hand over, tracing the calluses on her palm with his thumb. It was a rough working woman's hand, not the soft hand of a lady, and he seemed to revere it all the more for that. "Clara," he said. Her name sounded like a prayer in his mouth, or perhaps a warning. "Don't," she said, cutting off his protest. "Don't tell me to go back to bed. Don't tell me it is dangerous." "It is dangerous," Eli rasped. His voice was wrecked, raw with a need he had denied for years. I am not a gentle man, Clara, not anymore." "I do not want to be gentle," Clara said. "I want real." She leaned forward. The movement was slow, giving him 1,000 chances to stop her. He did not. She pressed her lips to the scar on his chest. Eli made a sound low in his throat, a sound of surrender. He dropped the bridle. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. He looked at her as if he were trying to memorize her, as if he expected her to vanish like smoke. He kissed her. It was not the kiss of a barroom conquest. It was slow, terrifyingly slow. His lips were dry and warm. He kissed her with a trembling hesitation, as though he were afraid she was made of glass and he was nothing but stones. He tasted coffee and tobacco and sorrow. Clara made a small noise and pressed closer, her hands tangling in his hair. The restraint in him shattered. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her with a desperation that took her breath away. They moved to the bed, a tangle of limbs and shadows. The room smelled of wood smoke and skin. Eli undressed her with shaking hands, treating each button, each layer of fabric, as an obstacle to salvation. When he saw the scars on her own body, the old bruises, the marks of a hard life, he did not look away. He traced them with his fingertips, offering a silent benediction. Their first time was a quiet collision. It was gentle. Yes, because Eli held back the storm inside him, moving with an agonizing care. He watched her face, reading every nuance of her expression, terrified of hurting her, terrified of being like the men she had learned to hate. But beneath the gentleness was an aching, hollow need. They were two broken people trying to fit their jagged edges together to make something whole. Clara felt tears pricking her eyes. She felt unworthy of this reverence. She was Clara of the Golden Spur, the woman who knew how to handle drunks, the woman who had seen murder and run. She did not know what to do with a man who touched her as if she were holy. When it was over, the silence returned, but it was changed. It was heavy with the weight of what they had just shared. Clara lay in the crook of his arm, her head on his shoulder. The fire had died down to embers. The wind was still howling outside, but it felt distant now. She felt a sob build in her chest. She tried to swallow it, but it broke free. A sharp, ragged gasp, then another. She turned her face into his neck and wept. She cried for the girl she had been before the world taught her to be hard. She cried for the shame of wanting him so much. She cried because for the first time in her life, she was naked and vulnerable, and she was not afraid of the man beside her. Eli did not speak. He did not try to hush her. He simply tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer against his side. He rested his chin on the top of her head and stared into the darkness, his hand stroking her hair with a rhythmic, soothing motion. He let her pour her grief into him, absorbing it as the dry earth absorbs the rain. The morning light was cruel. It slanted through the window in gray beams, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Clara woke first. She lay still for a moment, the memory of the night before washing over her with the force of a physical blow. She looked at Eli. He was asleep, his face relaxed in a way she had never seen. He looked younger. Panic seized her. It was a cold, sharp claw in her gut. What had she done? She had bound herself to this man. She had given him the one thing she had sworn to keep locked away, her heart, not just her body. If he died because of her, if Tanner killed him, the guilt would destroy her. She slipped out of the bed, shivering as the cold air hit her skin. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. She went to the stove and began to build up the fire, making more noise than necessary. Eli woke. He sat up, the blanket falling to his waist. He looked at her, a slow smile beginning to form on his lips. Clara did not smile back. She held her back to him, aggressively grinding coffee beans. "Clara," he said. His voice was rough with sleep. "It was a mistake," Clara said. The words tasted like ash. Eli went still. "What?" "Last night," she said, turning to face him. She kept her chin high, her eyes hard. It was the mask she wore when she had to throw a drunk out of the saloon. "It shouldn't have happened. The situation is too dangerous. We aren't thinking clearly." Eli looked at her for a long time. The smile vanished. His face closed up, the shutters coming down over his eyes. He looked at the wall, then back at her. He did not argue. He did not plead. He was a man used to loss. He simply accepted this as another thing that was too good to keep. "If that is how you feel," he said quietly. "It is." Clara lied. Her heart was screaming at her to go back to him, to crawl under the warm blankets and hide from the world. She wondered what it would be like to stay here, to be Clara Morgan, to watch the seasons change from this window. But she could not let herself dream. Dreams were what got you killed. "I need supplies," Eli said abruptly. He threw off the covers and stood up, unashamed of his nakedness as he reached for his trousers. "We are low on coffee and flour, and I need to know what is happening down there." "You can't go to town," Clara said, fear spiking in her voice. "They will be watching." "I can, and I will," Eli said. He dressed with efficient, jerky movements. "I will go to the mining outpost at Granite Creek. It is smaller than San Rojo. News travels, but faces aren't as well known." He strapped his gun belt around his waist. He put on his heavy coat and his hat. He looked like a stranger again. "You stay here," he commanded. He picked up the Winchester and checked the load. "Keep the door barred. Don't open it for anyone but me. I will knock 3 times, then pause, then twice." Clara nodded. She wanted to tell him to be careful. She wanted to tell him she didn't mean what she said. Instead, she handed him a piece of dried venison. "Come back," she whispered. Eli looked at her, his hand on the latch. "I always come back." He slipped out the door, and the cold rushed in to take his place. The ride to Granite Creek took 4 hours through the deep snow. Eli pushed the big bay stallion hard, his mind a turmoil of anger and confusion. He felt the phantom sensation of Clara's skin against his, her tears on his neck. Her rejection stung, but beneath the hurt, he understood it. She was a creature of survival. She was trying to cut the ties before they could be severed by a bullet. Granite Creek was a miserable collection of shacks and tents clinging to the side of a canyon, inhabited by men who had failed to find gold elsewhere. The general store was a leaning structure of raw pine that smelled of kerosene and rotting potatoes. Eli tied the stallion to the rail and walked in. He kept his hat low, his collar up. He bought a sack of flour, 5 pounds of coffee, and a side of bacon, while the clerk, a man with one eye and a tremor in his hands, tallied the bill. Eli walked over to the notice board by the pot-belly stove. There it was, a wanted poster. The ink was fresh. It bore a sketch that looked vaguely like Clara. Dark hair, high cheekbones, wanted. It read, Clara Rios, for theft and sedition, dead or alive. Reward, $500. $500. That was a fortune. That was enough to make every drifter in the territory a hunter. Theft and sedition. A voice rasped behind him. Eli turned slowly. 3 men were sitting around a crate, playing cards. They were rough trade, miners or hired guns, dirty and looking for trouble. That is a lot of money for a Mexican whore, the man said. He was missing his front teeth, and his eyes were watery and mean. Word is, she stole the sheriff's payroll. But my cousin in San Rojo says she just saw something she wasn't supposed to, says she was Sheriff Tanner's personal entertainment, and she got greedy. The other men laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. Eli felt a cold rage settle over him. It was a familiar feeling, a cloak of ice that sharpened his vision and slowed his heart. He walked over to the table. "You have a foul mouth, friend," Eli said softly. The man looked up, squinting. "And who might you be? Her pimp?" Eli did not hesitate. He did not telegraph the move. He drove his right fist into the man's face with the force of a sledgehammer hitting rock. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. The man flew backward, his chair shattering against the floor. He lay there, groaning, blood gushing from his ruined nose. The other 2 men scrambled to stand, their hands going for their belts. Eli stepped back, his hand hovering over the Colt on his hip. He did not draw, but the threat was absolute. He looked at them with eyes that had seen the slaughter at Antietam and the starving winters of the High Plains. "Sit down," Eli said. They sat. Eli turned back to the counter. The clerk was staring at him, mouth open. "And 2 boxes of 44-40 ammunition," Eli said calmly, "and a box of 45 Colt." He paid with gold dust, collected his supplies, and walked out. He did not run. He untied his horse, checked the cinch, and mounted up. But as he rode out of town, he felt the eyes on his back. He knew the peace was over. The ride back was a gauntlet. The sun was sinking, casting long purple shadows across the snow. Eli kept to the trees, avoiding the open trail. He knew he was being followed. He could feel it. About 2 miles from the cabin, the trail narrowed, passing through a dense thicket of aspen and spruce. Eli pulled the stallion up. He dismounted and slapped the horse on the rump, sending it trotting up the path alone. He moved into the trees, sinking into the deep snow. He found a spot behind a fallen log that offered cover and a clear line of sight down the trail. He levered around into the chamber of his Winchester and waited. 10 minutes later, they appeared. 2 riders. They were tracking his horse's prints, their heads down. They were not the men from the store. These were harder men, professionals. Maybe the same ones who had chased Clara. They slowed as they saw the empty trail ahead. "Where is he?" one shouted. "Tracks keep going," the other said. "He must be walking." "Or waiting," the first one said, reaching for his rifle. Eli exhaled. He aimed at the chest of the lead rider. He did not want to kill. He was tired of killing. But Clara was waiting in that cabin. Clara, who had cried in his arms. Clara, who had looked at him with hope before she remembered to be afraid. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound flat and loud in the cold air. The lead rider was punched backward out of his saddle, hitting the snow with a thud. He did not move. The second rider panicked. He spurred his horse, wheeling it around. Eli worked the lever of the Winchester, the brass casing flying into the snow. He fired a second shot, deliberately wide, taking a chunk of bark off a tree right next to the man's head. "Tell Tanner!" Eli roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Tell him I am waiting." The rider did not look back. He galloped down the trail, disappearing into the gloom. Eli stood up. He walked over to the fallen man. He was dead before he hit the ground. Eli looked at him for a moment, feeling the old, familiar weight of a taken life settle onto his soul. He caught the man's horse, mounted it, and rode up the trail to catch his stallion. When he reached the cabin, it was fully dark. He dismounted, his body aching, the adrenaline crash leaving him shaking. He grabbed the supplies and walked to the door. He knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice. The bar slid back instantly. The door flew open. Clara stood there, the Colt Navy in her hand, her eyes wild. She saw him, saw the blood on his coat, not his own, but she didn't know that. Saw the grim set of his jaw. "Eli," she choked out. She dropped the gun. She did not ask if it was a mistake. She did not ask about the danger. She threw herself at him, launching her body against his with a force that nearly knocked him over. Eli dropped the supplies in the snow. He caught her, lifting her off her feet. He kicked the door shut behind them, shutting out the cold and death and the world. Clara was kissing him before he could speak. This was not the gentle, hesitant kiss of the night before. This was fierce. I was hungry. It was the kiss of a woman who had spent the last 6 hours thinking he was dead. Her hands were in his hair, on his face, checking for wounds. "You came back," she gasped against his mouth. "You came back." "I told you," Eli growled. He carried her to the bed. There was no slow undressing this time. There was a frantic urgency, a desperate need to prove that they were both alive, both here, both warm. Clara's fingers dug into his shoulders, her nails biting into the skin. She pulled him down to her, arching her back, demanding him. "Make me forget," she whispered. "Make me forget them." Eli silenced her with his mouth. He kissed her with a possessive intensity that matched her own. The desire that flared between them was hot and bright, fueled by the adrenaline of the ambush and the terror of loss. It was a claim. It was a declaration of war against anyone who tried to separate them. Their second time was a battle and a dance. It was sweat and friction and the desperate, rhythmic affirmation of life in the face of death. When Clara cried out, it was not in shame, but in triumph. And when Eli finally let go, burying his face in the curve of her neck, he knew that he was no longer just a man hiding from the world. He was a man with something to lose, and God help anyone who tried to take it. The thaw arrived not with a shout, but with a whisper. It began as the dripping of icicles from the eaves of the cabin, a rhythmic tapping that counted down the seconds of their reprieve. The snow, which had acted as a fortress wall, began to retreat, revealing patches of wet, brown earth that smelled of rot and rebirth. The mountain pass would soon be open, and with the clear roads came the inevitability of the hunt. Eli Morgan stood on the porch, watching the water run in rivulets down the path he had shoveled. He smoked a cigarette he had rolled with the last of his tobacco. His eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun on the diminishing drifts. He knew the waiting game was over. Staying meant dying. He went inside. Clara was packing the few belongings she had. She moved with a nervous energy, her eyes darting to the window every time a branch snapped in the warming woods. Eli told her they had to move. He said the snow was melting fast in the lower valley. He suggested they head north, toward Santa Fe. He knew a federal judge there, a man who owed him a favor from the war days. If they could get out of the territory, or at least to a jurisdiction where Sheriff Tanner held no sway, she might be safe. Clara stopped packing. She stood by the table, her hands gripping the rough wood until her knuckles turned white. She shook her head slowly. She said going north would not be enough. She said Tanner would never stop, not for a witness. But he was not chasing a witness. He was chasing a liability. She looked at Eli, her dark eyes fierce and frightened. She revealed the truth she had held back even in their most intimate moments. She told him about the journal. She explained that living in the Golden Spur had made her invisible to the men who drank there. They spoke of bribes, of stolen cattle, of murders covered up as accidents. And she had written it all down. She had a ledger, stolen from the dry goods store, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed in the boarding house. It contained dates, names, and amounts. It detailed Tanner's cut of the railway protection money. It was not just a diary. It was an indictment. Clara said she kept it for insurance, thinking it would buy her freedom one day. Instead, it had bought a price on her head. That was why the bounty was $500. They did not just want her dead. They wanted to burn that book. Eli listened in silence. The smoke from his cigarette curled blue in the shaft of sunlight. He understood now. The stakes were not just survival. They were justice. If they ran to Santa Fe without the book, they were fugitives. If they went back and got it, they were accusers. He crushed the cigarette out on the stone hearth. He said they were going back. The preparation took 2 days. Eli rode to a neighboring homestead, a place 5 miles east run by an old trapper named Silas. He sold the bulk of his remaining cattle and 2 of his best unbroken colts. He needed cash, and he needed to travel light. He told Silas he was moving on, chasing a new start in Oregon. It was a lie, but in the West, lies were the currency of travel. He returned with a heavy saddlebag of gold coins and a plan. They would ride to the outskirts of San Rojo, retrieve the journal under the cover of darkness, and then turn north. He spoke of hiring a wagon once they reached the main road, of assuming false names, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, settlers bound for the Dakotas. It was a fragile hope, but it was all they had. They rode out at dawn on a Tuesday, the sky a bruised purple over the peaks. Clara rode the roan gelding Eli had nursed back to health, and Eli rode his massive bay stallion. They descended from the high timber into the scrublands, the air growing warmer and thicker with dust the lower they went. The journey was a quiet one. The landscape shifted from the sanctuary of the pines to the exposure of the Red Rock canyons. They rode single file, Eli taking the lead, his Winchester resting across his saddle horn. He was constantly scanning the horizon, his head moving in slow, methodical sweeps. Clara watched his back. She watched the way he sat in the saddle, easy and loose, yet ready to violently uncoil at a moment's notice. He did not fill the silence with empty promises. He did not tell her that everything would be fine, or that he would save her. He simply placed his body between her and the world. She realized, as they crossed a swollen creek, the water rushing white and cold around the horse's legs, that his silence was a language of its own. Other men she had known used words as traps or tools of seduction. Eli used his presence. He checked her cinch every morning to ensure she would not fall. He gave her the cleaner portion of the water. He slept on the windward side of the fire to block the chill. He did not say he loved her, but he rode beside her, mile after mile, into the mouth of the hell she had escaped. That was a vow more sacred than anything spoken in a church. On the 3rd day, they entered a narrow pass known as Devil's Throat. The walls of the canyon rose 300 feet on either side, sheer cliffs of sandstone that blotted out the afternoon sun. The shadows were long and deep, and the wind made a hollow, moaning sound as it funneled through the rock. Eli signaled for her to stop. He held up a hand, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. The bay's ears were pinned back. Clara felt the hair on her arms stand up. The silence in the canyon was absolute. No birds, no insects, just the wind. Eli began to turn his horse, his mouth opening to shout a warning. The shot rang out before he could speak. It was a crack like a whip, magnified 100 times by the canyon walls. A puff of smoke bloomed from a cluster of boulders high up on the ridge to their right. Clara's horse screamed. It was a terrible, human sound. The bullet had struck the roan in the neck. The animal reared, its legs flailing, blood spraying in a hot mist. Clara was thrown from the saddle. She hit the hard-packed dirt with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs, rolling instinctively toward the canyon wall. The roan collapsed. thrashing in the dust, trapping her rifle beneath its weight. More shots erupted, a hail of lead pinging off the rocks around them. They were pinned down. It was an ambush, well laid and merciless. Eli did not run. He spurred the bay stallion, not away from the fire, but across the line of it, drawing the shooter's eyes. He pulled his Winchester and fired one-handed, working the lever with a fluid, deadly speed. He was making himself a target to buy her time. "Run!" he roared. "Clara, get to the rocks!" Clara scrambled on her hands and knees, dragging herself behind a fallen slab of sandstone. She looked back. A bullet caught Eli. She saw the impact. It struck him high in the left shoulder, jerking him backward in the saddle. He nearly fell, but his hand clamped onto the saddle horn with a desperate strength. He fired again, suppressing the gunman on the ridge. He wheeled the stallion around, galloping toward her position. He slid from the horse while it was still moving, hitting the ground and stumbling into the cover of the rock slab beside her. He was pale, his teeth gritted in a rictus of pain. Blood was already soaking the entire left side of his duster. "They have the high ground," Eli gasped. Pressing his back against the stone, he checked his rifle. "We have to move. There is a cave. Further back, a washout." The gunfire intensified, chipping away at their cover. Stone fragments rained down on them. "Can you walk?" Clara asked, grabbing his good arm. "I can fight," Eli growled, though his eyes were glassy with shock. They moved. It was a desperate, scrambling retreat. Clara practically dragged him, her arm around his waist, half carrying his weight. They moved from boulder to boulder, using the terrain to shield them from the snipers above. The outlaws shouted to one another, their voices echoing like demons, confident that their prey was cornered. They found the cave. It was little more than a deep fissure in the canyon wall, hidden behind a screen of dry brush. Clara pushed Eli inside and collapsed next to him. The space was small, damp, and smelled of bat guano and old dust. But it was defensible. The entrance was narrow. The men would have to come in single file. Eli slumped against the cave wall. His breathing was ragged and shallow. The blood loss was significant. The bullet had not exited. It was lodged deep in the muscle, grinding against the bone. Outside, the shooting stopped. The outlaws were waiting. They knew the horse was dead. They knew the man was hit. They could afford to wait for nightfall. Clara looked at Eli. He was fading. His skin was gray, clammy to the touch. If she did not get the bullet out, the infection or the blood loss would kill him before morning. She unbuttoned his coat and tore open his shirt. The wound was an ugly, purple pucker oozing dark blood. "I have to take it out," Clara said. Her voice trembled, but her hands were steady. She reached into his pocket and pulled out his clasp knife. She sterilized the blade with the last drops of whiskey from his flask, then poured the rest over the wound. Eli hissed, his body arching off the dirt floor. "Do it," he whispered, "before I pass out." Clara had never performed surgery. She had dressed wounds. Yes, but digging into living flesh was a horror she was not prepared for. But she looked at the entrance of the cave, where the light was fading, and then at the man who had ridden into hell for her. She gripped the knife. She told him to hold on. The next hour was a blur of blood and terror. Eli groaned, a low, guttural sound that tore at her heart. When the knife tip found the lead, he screamed once, then slumped into unconsciousness. Clara wept silently as she worked, her fingers slick with his blood, until she finally levered the flattened slug free. She packed the wound with strips of her petticoat and bound it tight. Night fell. The temperature in the canyon dropped rapidly. The cave became an icebox. Clara could not risk a fire. The smoke would give away their exact position to the men waiting outside. Eli began to shiver. It started as a tremor and grew into violent convulsions. The fever was setting in. Clara lay down beside him on the hard stone floor. She opened her coat and wrapped it around him, pressing her body against his to share her warmth. She pulled his heavy duster over both of them. In the pitch black, Eli began to talk. He was not talking to her. He was back in Virginia. He was back in the valley with the fever. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice thick and slurred. "Sarah, the water is rising. Stay with me." Clara stiffened. It hurt. It hurt more than she expected. To hear him call for a ghost while she was the one bleeding for him. "I am here," she whispered. "I failed you," Eli cried out softly, turning his head restlessly. "I couldn't stop it. I'm sorry. Don't leave me." Clara held him tighter. She stroked his damp hair, fighting back her own exhaustion. She realized then that his guilt was a living thing, a monster that ate him from the inside. He wasn't just afraid of dying. He was afraid of living and failing again. She leaned close to his ear. "I am not her," Clara whispered fiercely into the dark. "Eli, listen to me. I am not Sarah. I am Clara, and I am not leaving." He quieted for a moment, his breathing hitching. "Clara?" he breathed. "I am here," she said, "and I will stay. If you want me, I will stay until the end." She felt him relax slightly. The shivering began to subside as her body heat seeped into him. He buried his face in her shoulder, seeking comfort like a child. The cold pressed in from the canyon, a physical weight. But beneath the fear and the pain, something else took root. In that dark, freezing cave, with a smell of blood and dust in the air, Clara felt a profound sense of belonging. She was no longer running away. She was fighting for something. She was holding the only thing in the world that mattered to her. She held him through the long hours of the night. She listened to the footsteps of the men outside as they scouted the canyon floor, searching for them. She gripped the Colt Navy with one hand and held Eli with the other. When the gray light of dawn finally began to seep into the cave, Eli stopped thrashing. His breathing deepened into a natural rhythm. The fever had broken. Clara watched the light grow. She knew the men would come soon. They would find the cave. But for this moment, they were alive. She began to sing. It was a soft, mournful melody in Spanish, a song her mother used to sing while scrubbing the floors of the rich. It was a song about a swallow that flew too far from home, but found a tree that would shelter it. Eli stirred. He opened his eyes. They were clear. The glassy look of delirium was gone. He looked up at her. He saw the blood on her hands, the exhaustion etched into her face, the fierce set of her jaw. He heard the song. He did not speak. He reached up with his good hand and touched her cheek. His thumb brushed away a smudge of dirt. In that touch, there was no ghost of Sarah. There was only recognition. He saw her. He saw Clara. "You are singing," he rasped, his voice weak but steady. "To keep the spirits away," Clara said softly, stopping the song. "They are gone," Eli whispered, his eyes locking onto hers. "You chased them off." He tried to sit up, wincing as the pain in his shoulder flared. Clara helped him, propping him against the wall. "We have to move," he said, looking toward the entrance. "They will come with the sun." Clara nodded. She checked the cylinder of her revolver. She handed him his gun belt. "Can you ride?" she asked, though she knew they had no horses. "I can walk," Eli said. "And I can shoot." He looked at her, and for the first time since they met, he offered her a small, grim smile. "They'll face me first," he had said once, but now, looking at her, he corrected himself. "We face them together," he said. Clara helped him stand. They moved toward the light, leaving the cave and the ghosts behind them. The canyon waited, silent and deadly, but they stepped into it side by side. The return to San Rojo was a descent into the belly of the beast. They left the bay stallion and the stolen gelding in a thicket of mesquite a mile outside of town, approaching on foot under the cover of a moonless sky. The darkness was thick and suffocating, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth from the recent thaw. Every shadow looked like a gunman. Every rustle of the wind in the sagebrush sounded like a cocking hammer. Eli moved stiffly. The wound in his shoulder, though bound tight and cleaned, was a fire in his flesh. He favored his left side, his breath hitching with every step that jarred his frame. But he did not stop. He held his Winchester with a white-knuckled grip, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the sleeping town. They skirted the back alleys, moving behind the livery stable and the dry goods store. The mud sucked at their boots. The town was quiet, save for the tinny sound of a piano drifting from the Golden Spur and the occasional bark of a dog. When they reached the rear of the boarding house, Eli stopped. He pressed his back against the rough wood of the wall, his face pale in the gloom. "Go," he whispered. His voice was a rasp, tight with pain. "I will watch the alley. If things go wrong, you run. Do not look for me." Clara looked at him. She wanted to argue, to tell him she would not leave him, but there was no time. The journal was the key. Without it, they were just fugitives. With it, they were the law. "Wait for me," she said. She slipped through the back door, which she knew from memory always stuck on the jamb. She raised it gently, silencing the hinges. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old dust, a scent that instantly transported her back to a life she thought she had shed. She moved like a ghost up the narrow stairs, counting the creaking boards to avoid them. Her room was at the end of the hall. It was unlocked. Sheriff Tanner likely thought she was dead or long gone. There was no need to guard an empty bird cage. Clara entered and closed the door softly. The room was exactly as she had left it. The narrow bed, the cracked wash basin, the wardrobe that held her few pitiful dresses. It felt like a museum of a dead woman. She fell to her knees beside the bed, shoving the frame aside. Her fingernails scrabbled at the floorboards. She found the loose one, the third from the wall, and pried it up. It was there, the leather-bound ledger, wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. This book held the names of the men who had killed for profit, the dates of the shipments Tanner had allowed to be raided, the blood money he had taken. It was heavy, heavier than paper should be. She tucked it inside her shirt, against her skin. She stood up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had it. They could go. She turned to the door. From the alley below, a shout shattered the night. "He's here, behind the house!" It was followed immediately by the roar of a shotgun. Clara screamed, "Eli!" She threw the door open and sprinted down the hallway, heedless of the noise. She burst out the back door just as the alley erupted into chaos. Eli was crouched behind a stack of barrels, firing his Winchester. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like strobe lights. 3 men were advancing from the main street, taking cover behind the corner of the saloon. "Get back!" Eli roared. Seeing her emerge, he levered a fresh round and fired, the bullet kicking up dirt at the feet of the lead gunman. Clara drew her Colt Navy. She fired blindly toward the shapes in the dark, the recoil jarring her arm. "Run, Clara!" Eli shouted. He stood up, exposing himself to draw their fire away from her, but the trap had 2 jaws. As Clara turned to flee toward the stables, 2 more men stepped out from the shadows of the boarding house, their guns drawn. One of them was Jack Kincaid. He was smiling. "Going somewhere, darling," Kincaid sneered. He lunged. Clara tried to bring the gun around, but he was too fast. He backhanded her across the face, a blow that knocked the world sideways. She hit the ground hard, the taste of copper filling her mouth. Her gun skittered away into the mud. Kincaid grabbed her by the hair, hauling her to her knees. He pressed the cold muzzle of his revolver against her temple. "Drop it, cowboy!" Kincaid screamed at Eli. "Drop it or I paint the wall with her brains!" Eli froze. He was 20 feet away. He had a bead on the man to his left, but he saw Kincaid. He saw the gun at Clara's head. He saw the terror in her eyes and the blood running from her lip. The fight went out of him. It drained away, leaving him looking old and broken. He slowly lowered the rifle. "Let her go," Eli said. His voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "Gun on the ground," Kincaid commanded. Eli dropped the Winchester. Then he unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall. He raised his hands. "Don't," Clara whispered, the word choking her. "Eli, don't!" Men swarmed him. They hit him with the butts of their rifles, driving him to his knees. Clara watched, screaming, as they kicked him, the sounds of boots striking flesh sickeningly loud in the alley. "Enough!" a deep voice boomed. Sheriff Tanner stepped into the light of a lantern someone had raised. He looked at Eli, who was spitting blood into the dirt, and then at Clara. "Lock the bitch in the cell," Tanner said, adjusting his hat. "And take him to the stable. Make sure he lasts until morning. I want to hang him when the sun is up." Kincaid dragged Clara to her feet. She struggled, kicking and scratching, but he was strong. He marched her down the street, past the gawking faces of the townsfolk who had spilled out of the saloon. They looked at her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. No one moved to help. The jailhouse was a brick block in the center of town. Kincaid shoved her into the single cell and slammed the iron door. The key turned with a final, heavy clank. Clara threw herself against the bars, gripping the cold iron until her hands ached. "You can't do this. He needs a doctor." Kincaid just laughed and walked out, leaving her in the dark. Hours passed. The silence of the jail was broken only by the scratching of rats in the walls. Clara paced the small cell, her mind a whirlwind of panic. She touched the lump under her shirt. They hadn't searched for her. In their arrogance, they thought she was just a scared girl. They hadn't looked for the ledger. The door to the office opened. Sheriff Tanner walked in. He pulled a chair over to the cell door and sat down, straddling it. He lit a cigar, the pungent smoke drifting through the bars. "You caused me a lot of trouble, Clara," Tanner said. He sounded like a disappointed father. "All this running, and for what? A dead man?" "He is not dead," Clara said, her voice trembling with rage. "He will be," Tanner said. "At dawn. And you?" He looked her up and down, a slow, assessing gaze that made her skin crawl. "I was going to hang you too, but that seems like a waste. There are men down in Sonora who pay good gold for a woman with fire. I think I will sell you south, auction you off to the highest bidder. You will disappear, Clara, like you never existed." Clara stared at him. The threat was a cold bucket of water. It was the reality she had feared all her life. To be property, to be consumed. "You are a monster," she whispered. Tanner stood up. "I am a businessman. Enjoy your last night in bed. Clara, where you are going, you will be sleeping on the floor." He left, locking the outer door behind him. Clara stood in the center of the cell, breathing hard. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, to make her curl into a ball and wait for the end. But then she thought of Eli. She thought of him standing in the snow, teaching her to shoot. She thought of his body shielding hers in the canyon. "They'll face me first." She would not let him die. She reached up to her hair. Hidden in the thick braid was a long, steel hairpin she had sharpened against a rock during their days in the cabin. It was a small thing, pitiful against iron bars. But it was all she had. She went to the cell door. The lock was old, a heavy mechanism of tumblers and springs. She had seen the deputy struggle with it before. She inserted the pin. She closed her eyes, visualizing the inside of the lock. She worked the metal pick, feeling for the catch. Her hands were shaking. She forced them to be still. "Breathe, squeeze, don't pull. Click." The first tumbler gave. Outside, she could hear the guard snoring in the office. He was the new deputy, a boy named Billy who liked the bottle too much. Click, the second tumbler. Sweat ran down her forehead, stinging her split lip. If Billy woke up, if Tanner came back. The third tumbler shifted with a gritty resistance. Clara turned the pin, putting all her torque into it. The lock sprang open with a loud snap. Clara froze. She waited for the door to burst open. Silence. The snoring continued. She pushed the door open. It swung silently on well-oiled hinges. She stepped into the office. Billy was slumped at the desk, his head on his arms, a half-empty bottle of whiskey near his elbow. His keys were on his belt. His gun was in his holster. Clara moved toward him. She needed the gun. As she reached for the revolver, Billy snorted and sat up, his eyes blinking open. He saw her. Confusion clouded his face for a second, then recognition. He opened his mouth to shout, his hand grappling for his weapon. Clara did not think. She drove the sharpened hairpin into his thigh, sinking it deep into the muscle. Billy shrieked. A high, thin sound, and doubled over, clutching his leg. Clara grabbed the heavy whiskey bottle and brought it down on the back of his head. The glass did not break, but the impact made a dull thud. Billy slumped forward, unconscious. Clara snatched his revolver from the holster. It was a heavy army Colt. She checked the load. Full. She grabbed the keys from his belt and ran out the door. The street was empty. The town was asleep, confident that the excitement was over. Clara stuck to the shadows, moving toward the livery stable at the far end of town. She could see light spilling from the wide double doors. She crept up to the side of the barn, peering through a crack in the wood. The scene inside made her stomach turn. Eli was tied to a post in the center of the stable. His shirt had been torn away, and his back was a ruin of bruises and cuts. 2 men were taking turns hitting him, not with fists, but with a length of leather strap. One of them was the man Eli had punched in Granite Creek. He was enjoying his revenge. Eli's head hung low. He was not making a sound. Blood dripped from his chin onto the straw. "Had enough. Hero?" the man sneered, raising the strap again. Clara stepped into the open doorway. She held the Colt with both hands, leveling it at the man with the strap. "Step away from him," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the air like a knife. The men spun around. They saw a disheveled woman in a torn dress, holding a gun that looked too big for her hands. They laughed. "Look at this," the second man said, stepping forward. "The little bird got out of her cage. Put the gun down, girl, before you hurt yourself." He took another step, his hand dropping to his own weapon. Clara fired. She did not aim for the chest. She aimed low. The bullet struck the man in the left knee. His leg buckled, the bone shattering. He screamed and went down. Clutching the ruin of his knee, the man with the strap froze. He looked at his partner writhing in the dust. Then back at Clara. He saw the look in her eyes. It was the same look Eli had worn in the cabin. It was the look of someone who had crossed a line and burned the bridge behind them. "Drop the belt," Clara commanded. "And unchain him." The man dropped the strap. He moved slowly, hands raised, and undid the ropes binding Eli's wrists. Eli slumped forward, his legs unable to hold him. Clara rushed to him, keeping the gun trained on the standing man. She wrapped her arm around Eli's waist, hauling him up. "Eli," she whispered. "Eli, we have to go." Eli lifted his head. His left eye was swollen shut, and his lip was split. He looked at her through a haze of pain, and a flicker of amazement crossed his battered face. "Clara," he croaked. "Walk," she ordered. "Move your feet." She backed them out of the stable, dragging him. "Get inside," she told the standing outlaw. "And if you stick your head out, I will kill you." The man retreated into the shadows of the barn, terrified. There were 2 horses tied to the rail, Tanner's deputies' mounts. Fresh, strong quarter horses. Clara helped Eli into the saddle of the nearest one. He groaned, swaying dangerously, but he gripped the mane. Clara mounted the second horse. She tied Eli's reins to her saddle horn. "Hold on," she said. She kicked her horse into a gallop. They tore out of San Rojo, the hoofbeats thundering like a drum roll. Behind them, shouts erupted as the town woke up again, but they were already gone, swallowed by the vast, indifferent darkness of the desert. They rode until the horses were blown, pushing deep into the labyrinth of canyons to the west. They did not stop until the sun began to paint the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Clara found a hidden cut in the rock, a place where an old stream bed provided shelter and a trickling spring. She helped Eli down. He collapsed onto the sand, his breathing ragged. For the next 2 days, they did not move. The world shrank down to the size of that ravine. Clara tended to him with a fierce, singular focus. She tore the hem of her dress to make bandages. She washed the blood from his back and his face. She forced water between his cracked lips. She hunted lizards and snakes for food, cooking them over a small, smokeless fire. She was no longer the girl who wiped tables. She was a creature of the wild, hardened in the forge of survival. On the 3rd night, Eli finally sat up. He leaned against the canyon wall, watching Clara clean the Colt revolver by the firelight. "You came back," he said. His voice was stronger, though still rough. Clara looked up. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair a tangled mess, but her eyes were clear. "You didn't give me a choice," she said. "You gave yourself up. I thought—" Eli paused, looking down at his hands. "I thought if I surrendered, they would let you live. I thought I could buy your life with mine. You can't buy my life, Eli," Clara said softly. "It belongs to me, and I chose to spend it getting you out." Eli shook his head slowly. "I never planned to live long. Clara, after Sarah, after the war, I was just waiting. I was looking for a bullet with my name on it. I thought that was my penance, to die alone in the snow." He looked at her, his gaze intense and vulnerable. "Then I found you on the trail," he said. "And suddenly, dying didn't seem like justice anymore. It seemed like a waste." Clara set the gun down. She moved to sit beside him. The heat radiating from him was familiar now, an anchor in the chaos. "I used to dream about this," she confessed, staring into the small flame. "Not the running, not the shooting, but being with someone who didn't want to take from me. I dreamt of being loved without having to check the door, without having to have a knife in my boot. I wanted to be loved without fear." She turned to him. She reached out and touched his bruised cheek, her fingers light as a feather. "You make me feel real," she whispered. "Not like a doll, not like a target, like a woman." Eli caught her hand. He pressed it to his lips. "You are the most real thing I have ever known," he said. He leaned in. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic collision of the cabin. It was not the kiss of two people trying to forget they were dying. It was slow. It was bruised and breathless. It tasted of pain and survival. But mostly, it tasted of reverence. Eli kissed her as if she were the air he needed to breathe. He held her face in his hands, his touch worshipful. Clara melted into him, her body softening against his hardness. There was no hurry. There was no fear of the dawn. In that canyon, surrounded by stone and silence, they did not make love to escape. They made love to arrive. They moved together with a quiet, aching tenderness, reclaiming their bodies from the violence that had been inflicted upon them. It was a solemn oath, sworn in skin and breath, that they were alive, and that they belonged to no one but each other. When they finally lay still, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the canopy of stars, Clara rested her head on his chest. She listened to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "We have the book," she whispered into the dark. "We have the book." Eli agreed, his arm tightening around her. "And we have guns." "Santa Fe," she said. "Santa Fe," he echoed. "We finished it. But for tonight, there was no sheriff, no bounty, no past. There was only the fire, the stars, and the man who had faced death to keep her safe, holding her as if she were the rarest treasure in the territory. The road to Santa Fe was a ribbon of dust stretching north through a landscape that seemed to have been hammered out of copper and bronze. Clara Rios and Eli Morgan rode not as fugitives, but as pilgrims seeking a shrine of justice that might not even exist. The panic that had driven them into the canyons had crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. They were done running. The ledger Clara carried against her chest, wrapped in oilcloth and pressed tight to her skin, was no longer just an insurance policy. It was a weapon, heavier and more deadly than the Colts hanging at their hips. They reached the territorial capital as the sun was setting, painting the adobe walls of the city in shades of blood, orange, and violet. Santa Fe was a world away from the grime of San Rojo. It was older, carrying the weight of centuries in its narrow streets and the bells of the cathedral. But even here, Clara felt the phantom gaze of Sheriff Tanner. She kept her hat pulled low, her eyes darting to every shadow. Eli rode close beside her. His shoulder was stiff, and his face was drawn with the lingering pain of his wound. But he sat in the saddle with an upright defiance. He led them not to a boarding house, but straight to the residence of Circuit Judge Silas Halloway. Eli knew the man from the war, a former major who had kept his honor when the world was burning. The meeting took place in a study that smelled of beeswax and old paper. Judge Holloway, a man with a mane of white hair and eyes like flint, listened in silence as Clara laid the ledger on his mahogany desk. She opened it with trembling fingers. She showed him the columns of numbers, the dates of the payroll robberies, the payoffs marked with Tanner's initials. She spoke of the murder in the alley, her voice steady, refusing to break. She was no longer the terrified girl in the saloon. She was a witness to the rot at the heart of the territory. Holloway read for a long time. The clock on the mantel ticked, each second a hammer blow against Clara's nerves. Finally, the judge looked up. He did not smile, but his expression was grave and furious. He promised them that the United States Marshals would ride at dawn. He promised an investigation that would strip San Rojo to its bones. He offered them sanctuary in the city until it was done. Eli looked at Clara. They stood by the fireplace, the warmth doing little to chase the chill from their bones. He told her she should stay. He said she would be safe here, behind walls and laws. Clara shook her head. She looked at the map on the judge's wall, at the empty spaces of the Southern Territory. She said that a piece of paper signed by a judge was not safe. Safety was knowing the wolf was dead. She said she was going back. She wanted to see the end of it. She wanted to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Eli did not argue. He saw the steel in her spine. He simply nodded and said that if they were going back, they were going back prepared. They rode out 2 days later, flanked by 4 federal marshals. But the marshals were men of the law, bound by jurisdiction and procedure. They rode the main road. Eli, sensing the shift in the wind, led Clara along a parallel route, a deer trail that hugged the river, moving faster, staying ghost-like in the terrain he knew better than the lines of his own hand. The journey south was tense. The land seemed to hold its breath. The hawks circling overhead looked like vultures waiting for a meal. They reached the bend of the Pecos River on a Tuesday afternoon. The water was high, swollen with the melt from the high country, churning brown and angry against the banks. The trail here was forced into a choke point, squeezed between the rushing water and a steep rise of limestone bluffs dotted with gnarled cottonwoods. Eli pulled his horse up. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The silence was too deep. The birds had stopped singing. He turned to Clara, his mouth opening to shout a warning. The attack did not begin with a shout, but with a volley of gunfire that shredded the leaves of the cottonwoods. Sheriff Tanner had not waited in town. He had ridden out to meet them. He had brought the last of his loyal dogs, men who knew that if the ledger reached the courts, they would all hang. Eli's horse reared, screaming as a bullet plowed into the dirt beneath its hooves. Eli fought the animal, spinning it around. He saw them, 5 men on the ridge, Tanner in the center, a buffalo rifle in his hands. "Get to the trees," Eli roared. He slapped the rump of Clara's horse, sending her bolting toward a cluster of boulders near the water's edge. He did not follow immediately. He held his ground in the open, levering his Winchester, drawing their fire. Bullets buzzed around him like angry hornets. One tore through the lapel of his coat. Another shattered the stock of his rifle. He drew his Colt, firing blindly at the ridge to keep their heads down. Clara hit the ground behind the rocks, her chest heaving. She scrambled for a position, resting her revolver on the stone. She saw Eli out in the open, a lone figure against the brown water. "Eli!" she screamed. "Get down!" Eli spurred his horse, driving it toward her position. He slid from the saddle while the animal was still moving, crashing into the dirt beside her. They were pinned. The river was at their backs, deep and fast. The shooters had the high ground. "They are coming down," Eli gasped, checking the cylinder of his gun. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, blood blinding his left eye. "They know we are alone. The marshals are miles behind." Clara looked up. Tanner and his men were advancing, moving from rock to rock, closing the noose. Tanner was shouting, taunting them. He called out that he would burn the book, and then he would burn them. "We have to break their line," Eli said. His voice was calm, the deadly calm of a soldier who had accepted the end. "I will draw them left. You take the shot when Tanner shows himself." "No." Clara grabbed his arm. "No, you are not sacrificing yourself." "It is not a sacrifice, Clara," Eli said, looking at her with an intensity that stopped her heart. "It is the job." He did not give her time to argue. He surged up from behind the rock, running in a crouch toward the riverbank, firing as he moved. The outlaws turned their guns on him. The air erupted with lead. Tanner stood up from behind a fallen log. Leveling his buffalo rifle at Eli's exposed back, he took his time. He smiled. Clara saw him. She saw the black bore of the rifle. She saw the sheriff's finger tighten on the trigger. She did not think. She did not breathe. She stood up, exposing herself fully to the enemy fire. She leveled the heavy Colt Navy, holding it with 2 hands just as Eli had taught her. "Squeeze. Do not pull." She fired. Her bullet struck the stock of Tanner's rifle, splintering the wood and deflecting his aim. His shot went wide, splashing harmlessly into the river. Tanner roared in fury. Turning his gaze to her, he drew his sidearm, abandoning the ruined rifle. At the same moment, a hidden gunman in the brush to the right fired a shotgun. Eli saw the shooter before Clara did. He saw the barrel poke through the sagebrush. He was 20 feet away from her. He could not shoot fast enough. He threw himself backward, abandoning his cover, launching his body into the space between the shotgun and Clara. The blast was a thunderclap. Eli was hit mid-air. The buckshot caught him in the chest and side, slamming him into the mud with sickening force. He tumbled, coming to rest near the water's edge, his blood instantly staining the brown earth red. "Eli!" Clara's scream tore her throat. Tanner was advancing, his gun raised, sensing victory. He did not see the woman anymore. He saw a target. Clara fell to her knees beside Eli, but she did not freeze. A cold, white-hot rage flooded her veins, displacing the fear. She looked up at Tanner. She saw the man who had been murdered in the alley. She saw the man who had threatened to sell her. She saw the man who had just killed the only person who had ever loved her. She raised the Colt again. Her hand was rock steady. Tanner laughed. "It is over, girl." "Yes," Clara whispered. "It is." She fired. The bullet took Sheriff Tanner square in the center of his chest. He looked surprised. He looked down at the hole in his vest, then back at her. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. He crumpled slowly, folding in on himself like a collapsing tent, and fell face first into the dirt. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall and hearing the thunder of approaching hooves from the north, the marshals finally arriving, broke and ran. Clara did not watch them go. She dropped her gun and crawled to Eli. He was lying on his back, staring up at the cottonwood leaves. His breathing was a wet, bubbling rasp. His chest was a ruin of blood and torn fabric. Clara pressed her hands over the wounds, trying to hold the life inside him. The blood was hot and slick, pumping between her fingers. "No," she wept, rocking back and forth. "No, no, no, you promised. You said you always come back." Eli turned his head. His eyes were losing focus, drifting toward the gray sky. He struggled to focus on her face. He smiled, a small, bloody curving of his lips. "Clara," he whispered. "I am here," she sobbed, leaning down to brush her forehead against his. "I am here. Stay with me. Please, God, stay with me." He coughed, a terrible sound. "I am not afraid," he wheezed. Every word cost him a breath he could not spare. "I was afraid for so long, but not now." "Don't talk," Clara begged. "Save your strength." "You—" Eli's hand fluttered, trying to reach her face. She caught it and pressed it to her cheek. "You gave me something worth dying for." His hand went heavy in hers. His eyes drifted shut. The bubbling breath stopped. Clara screamed. It was a sound of pure desolation, a wail that echoed off the canyon walls and silenced the river. She collapsed onto his chest, burying her face in his blood-soaked coat, shaking him, demanding that he wake up, demanding that the universe not be so cruel as to give her heaven only to snatch it away. Darkness took her then, a mercy of fainting that spared her the sight of the marshals pulling her away from his body. But death, it seemed, was not ready for Eli Morgan. Or perhaps Eli Morgan was simply too stubborn to go. The bullet and the buckshot had missed his heart by a fraction of an inch. The local doctor, a man who had learned his trade hacking limbs in the war, worked on him for 12 hours on the table of the saloon in the nearest settlement. Clara stood by the door the entire time, still covered in his blood, refusing to wash, refusing to eat, holding the doctor to his task with a gaze that promised murder if he failed. He survived. The recovery was slow and brutal. For weeks, Eli lay in a fever dream, fighting infection and the trauma of the wounds. Clara never left his side. She sat in the chair, holding his hand, singing the songs of her childhood, anchoring him to the world of the living. While he fought for breath, the territory changed. The trial in Santa Fe was the storm that broke the heat. With Tanner dead and the ledger in the hands of the federal government, the rot was exposed to the light. The mayor of San Rojo, the railway barons who had paid the bribes, the deputies who had looked the other way, they were dragged before the court. The testimony was damning. Clara stood on the stand, her voice clear and ringing, and told the story of the alley, the chase, and the man who had saved her. San Rojo was purged. New laws were written. A new sheriff, a man from the north with clean hands, was appointed. It was autumn before Eli could walk without a cane. It was winter before he could lift a saddle. But he healed. The scars on his chest were joined by new ones, a map of violence that told the story of their survival. They did not return to the town. They did not go back to the cabin in the high snows. They found a piece of land in the foothills, near the place where he had first found her bleeding on the trail. It was a valley of sweet grass and oak trees, sheltered from the wind but open to the sun. Eli built the house himself. He worked slowly at first, his strength returning with the rhythm of the saw and the hammer. He cut the timber from the forest. He hauled the stones for the chimney from the riverbed. It was not a shack. It was a home. It had a porch that faced the east and large windows to let in the light. Clara planted a garden. She learned to ride without fear. She kept the Colt Navy in a drawer by the bed, clean and oiled. But she no longer carried it on her hip. Life settled into a rhythm of peace that felt miraculous after the chaos of the hunt. They worked the land, they tended the horses, and in the evenings, they sat by the fire, reading or simply existing in the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's souls. One morning, a year after the gunfight at the river, the first snow of the season began to fall. It was a gentle snow, fat flakes drifting down from a pearl gray sky, covering the scars of the earth in a blanket of white. Clara stood at the open door of the house, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl. She watched the sunrise painting the clouds in streaks of gold and pink. The air was crisp and clean, tasting of pine and promise. She heard Eli's boots on the floorboards behind her. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. He was warm, solid, and alive. Clara leaned back into him. She took his hand, the one with the rough calluses and the white scars, and moved it from her waist to the curve of her belly. It was there, a small, firm swell that had not been there months before. Eli went still. His breath hitched. He spread his fingers, covering the life that was growing inside her. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was thick with an emotion that he no longer tried to hide. "A child," he whispered. "A family," Clara corrected softly. Eli turned her in his arms so he could look at her. His eyes searched hers, finding only peace and a fierce joy. He looked at her belly, then back at her face. He looked like a man who had been given a kingdom. He touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His expression darkened slightly, a shadow of the old protector surfacing. "They'll never touch you again," he vowed. It was a promise made to her, to the child, and to the universe. Clara smiled. It was a smile of absolute certainty. She reached up and smoothed the gray from his temple. They never could. she replied. Not with you beside me. Eli lowered his head and kissed her. The kiss was soft, tasting of the morning coffee and the cold air. It was a seal on their future. Around them, the snow began to fall harder, settling on the roof of the home they had built, on the fields they had cleared, and on the land they now called home. It fell softly, quietly, burying the past and watering the roots of the life that was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Clara and Eli. It has been a journey through the dust, the snow, and the gunpowder of the American West, and I hope their fight for love and justice resonated with you. I would love to hear where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below telling me your country or city. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of grit, romance, and survival on the frontier, please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Did you think they would make it? I look forward to reading your responses.